So for part 3 of our lecture on stimulants, we'll be discussing amphetamines. And when we start, we need to start at the beginning. And we'll start with a medicinal tea that's been used in Chinese civilizations for most of recorded history, made from ma huang, also known as ephedra. And you may actually have heard of these. They're still sometimes available as weight loss supplements and still actually quite dangerous. So you may have heard some press coverage of, we sometimes see cardiac arrest reported as a result of using ma huang. So the active ingredient here is ephedrine, and what it does is basically stimulate the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And it was, and occasionally sometimes still is in other parts of the world, used to treat asthma. So in 1932, we see amphetamine synthesized. So it's actually created in a lab, and it is created to have similar properties to ephedrine. So not the natural substance, not the naturally occurring substance, but one created for medical uses. So some early medical uses for amphetamine included asthma, narcolepsy, where people suddenly fall asleep or are unable to maintain awareness throughout the day, hyperactivity in children, and of course it was widely used as an appetite suppressant and a stimulant. And we talk about the use of amphetamines here in the United States. We have an interesting role for the history of the United States government. We actually saw amphetamines widely distributed during World War II to soldiers with the understanding that it would increase efficiency and reduce fatigue, which could be very important during some of the very dangerous situations faced by our military. And it wasn't only the United States government that was using it for these purposes. In the 1960s, we saw really widespread use of amphetamines or speed, often in combination with heroin. And we saw actually that many of the amphetamines that were being used for these purposes originated with legal prescriptions. So we saw after that period in the 1960s, the use of amphetamines being more tightly controlled. And because of that relationship between amphetamine use and cocaine use, the demand for stimulants seems to remain pretty steady. So this is when we saw that increase in cocaine use that we talked about in our previous lecture. And then we also started seeing the illicit manufacture of methamphetamine at this time. So methamphetamine and amphetamine are closely related, but methamphetamine is more highly processed than amphetamines, and that's part of the reason why it is so much more dangerous. So when we talk about the rise of methamphetamine, we're talking about the illicit manufacture here. So this is not something that was ever produced for medical purposes, as amphetamines were. And we've actually got an entire TV series now based around this idea that the illicit manufacture, the illegal manufacture of methamphetamine is dangerous and associated with toxic side effects. As we see the demand rise, we see that illicit manufacture rise and the many serious side effects that come with consuming those impurities. We mainly saw regional abuse rise in the 1990s. This was more common in the western and midwestern United States, less of an increase in eastern U.S. cities in the 1990s, where cocaine really remained the drug of choice. Now, when we talk about how amphetamine actually affects the body or the pharmacology of it, we see that it's part of the reason why it has such powerful effects is because its chemical structure is similar to those catecholamine neurotransmitters that we talked about. And basically, it increases activity of monoamine neurotransmitters by stimulating their release. And we're back to the usual suspects. We're talking about dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Now, because of the structure of methamphetamine being slightly different, it crosses that blood-brain barrier more easily, and it produces more central nervous system side effects compared to ephedrine, which is less able to cross that barrier, and its effects are more in the peripheral nervous system and less in the central nervous system. Talking about absorption and elimination for amphetamines, here the effects are not quite as rapid if orally ingested. About an hour and a half if consumed orally, but of course that's not how it's primarily consumed. Intranasal administration, consuming through the nose, effects within 5 to 20 minutes, and an IV injection or smoking effects occur within 5 to 10 minutes. Its half-life is longer than cocaine, so about half of the product is metabolized in the first 5 to 12 hours, and is typically completely eliminated within 2 days. One real concern with amphetamines is the idea of rapid tolerance or tachyphylaxis. So if people take a high dose early on, it's going to increase their chances of becoming developing tolerance much more quickly. And of course, once the person has developed tolerance, then they need to take a higher dose to experience similar effects. So this can lead us to severe dependence concerns and health problems more quickly than with other drugs. We did see some beneficial uses for amphetamines. Remember, these were created for medical purposes. When we talk about, we're going to be talking about drugs for mental disorders during this week as well. And we see widespread use of amphetamines to treat depression in the 1950s and 1960s. We do sometimes still see that used, although not as a primary course of treatment. And one major advantage here is that as an antidepressant, its effects can occur relatively quickly, which is not something that we necessarily see with other treatments. And we're also probably familiar with its history as use for weight control. In the 1960s, it was widely recommended to reduce appetite and body weight when used for short periods of time. That wasn't necessarily how it was used, and as it got used for longer periods of time, we started to see some of those more serious side effects. And also, we don't really know whether it has long-term effects on obesity or not. Studies seem to show different results, but in general, probably not a good approach to controlling your body weight. Believe it or not, methamphetamine is still currently FDA approved for weight control purposes, although it comes with a very strong warning that it has a high potential for abuse and should only be tried in patients for whom other alternatives have been ineffective. So it'd be very difficult at this time, I'm sure, to find a doctor who'd be willing to prescribe that for you, and part of that is related to its serious risks for dependency, as well as this concern that really whether it's going to work over the long term is unclear. Other beneficial uses for amphetamines include treatment of narcolepsy. It was one of the reasons why the substance was developed in the first place, and it remains true. And it's available by prescription under the trade name Desoxyn. It's still not widely available, again, because of that high risk for dependence. So we do have some perceived benefits that people still consider amphetamines useful for. This concept of smart pills or studied drugs that we talked about for a discussion question. And of course the data on this is really not supporting its current use in this manner. So with depending on the dose and the kind of task, we really don't see the results that would make it worth the health risks to consume them for this particular purpose. And then the other use that we see as a potential perceived benefit among some populations is its use during sports as a performance-enhancing drug. When this was actually tested, we see some slight improvements in athletic performance, but probably not enough, or definitely not enough to be worth the risks to an athlete's career if they tested positive for this particular substance. So some of the reasons why people continue to take them on an illicit basis are not really supported by the literature on the uses of those drugs. And you saw this chart in your text basically talking about the difference between a reaction time for a simple task and a more complex task while on a dose of methamphetamine. So can make immediate reaction time a little faster, but if it's anything that requires a little bit of judgment or more thought, then we definitely see that response time slow down. So all in all, probably not recommended. Other beneficial uses for methamphetamines include treatment of ADHD. So we tend to see a lot of discussion about the use of drugs like Ritalin and Adderall among children with this diagnosis. So lots of social issues about whether we're trying to medicate natural childhood behavior, whether it's a good idea to use this particular approach in children. But for a group of children with serious ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, these drugs can cause dramatic increases in their ability to pay attention, to remain focused, and to behave within normal social boundaries. So we don't exactly know why that works, but we suspect that it's a difference in neurotransmitter developmental levels among children with this diagnosis. But it remains an important fact that for children who have this diagnosis with serious problems with the condition, that the drug can in fact help them. Whether all of those diagnoses are legitimate, whether the Some children get diagnosed just as an attempt to control their behavior. Those are all different issues. But for children with this diagnosis, this drug does help. But it does retain some level of danger, which is why it's only available by prescription. So we do have some concerns, some studies that have talked about the potential for students who have used Ritalin and Adderall as children to become abusers of other drugs or to experience side effects. And we really have kind of a lack of clear results in the data. Some studies show that students who consume or who are diagnosed with these types of drugs for ADHD are more likely to become dependent. But other studies show that students with these prescriptions end up being more successful in their school careers and in their social and personal lives, which can protect against those risk factors like feelings of isolation and alienation, identification with a toxic peer group that we know are risk factors for future drug abuse. So we don't really have clear data on this yet for the long-term effects, but we do have clear data that for children who are suffering from these types of conditions, that it can cause a really dramatic improvement in their behavior. So in terms of toxicities for amphetamines and methamphetamines, we do see some acute behavioral toxicities. We see increases in feelings of power, of paranoia. In animals at very high doses, we see a concern about destroying catecholamine neurons. So this would be very dangerous nervous system effects, but we've never seen these same results in humans because we simply don't use the same doses that are used in the animal studies. So much higher than we'd ever recommend for use in humans. And then another concern is that during, again, that illegal manufacturing process, we may be creating additional contaminants through adulteration that may be neurotoxic on their own. So definite concerns for acute toxicity, and then also concerns for chronic toxicity as well. One big concern here is this problem again with paranoid psychosis that we talked about with cocaine, particularly following binge use. Now, we don't necessarily know whether it's the drug use that causes the psychosis, because we do know that many heavy methamphetamine users may have begun their drug use because of mental health issues, potentially schizoid personalities. We also know that habitual users of this stimulant drug do experience high levels of sleep deprivation. So we're not entirely sure whether it's strictly the effects of the drug or if it may be because of other influences. Again, similar with cocaine, for people who are successfully able to quit this highly addictive drug, we don't see permanent behavioral or personality disruption. So some good evidence that people who are able to quit are able to resume a normal life from a chronic toxicity perspective. Now, I just alluded to the fact that this is a has high potential to create dependence, and it's a psychological dependence in some individuals. It's a very potent reinforcer. We get that almost immediate effect within 5 to 20 seconds, and that great feeling, that immediate sense of power, euphoria, and then falling back down to a deep low afterwards. We do know that abuse potential for amphetamines and for methamphetamine is likely dose dependent, and that the small doses that are provided for medical use are rarely going to lead to those kinds of dependence issues. So for our lectures here today on stimulants, we talked about the history of cocaine and amphetamine use and how the rates of use are related. As one rises, the other falls, and we tracked that through the 20th century here in the United States. We talked about those selective racial impacts on sentencing guidelines for crack versus powder cocaine and efforts to see those revised. And we talked about the dependence potential of cocaine and amphetamines, and then also the acute and chronic toxicity concerns for both of these drugs. Thank you for your time, and I'll look forward to meeting with you for our next lecture.